Let's take a look at our Mishnah. Yud Beis Amud Aleph at the Mishnah. There's a lot of complexity in the sugya of mitoch, but the principle of mitoch is something that's introduced in this Mishnah. It's a principle that's adhered to by Beis Hillel, and it's the thing that allows us to carry not only food on Yantif, but all items that have a utility on Yantif. Why am I allowed to carry a chumash to shul, carry a sefer, carry my keys? Why am I allowed to do that on Yantif without an eruv? It's because the Torah permits me to do malaches ochel nefesh. It permits me to do any malacha that I need for the preparation and use of food on Yantif, which includes carrying. And Beis Hillel applies that to once the Torah opens up this malacha and says that I'm allowed to do it for the sake of food, then anytime I have a need for Yantif purposes, then that need is also permitted, even if it involves that same malacha. If the Torah permits it for ochel nefesh, it permits it for other utilities on Yantif as well. So that's the principle of mitoch. There obviously are limitations to this, but that's the subject of the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai omrim ein motzin loas hakatan v'loas halulav v'loas sefer Torah l'rishus harabim u'Beis Hillel matirin. Beis Shammai say that you're not allowed to carry a child or a lulav or a sefer Torah out in the public domain on Yantif, and Beis Hillel say it's perfectly fine. So the Gemara says Tani Tana Kamei de Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, where there was a brisa that was recited in front of Rabbi Yitzchak, and the brisa stated Hashochet olas nadava b'yom tov loke, and the brisa stated that if a person shechts a voluntary korban ola, so there's no food being obtained from this korban because it's a burnt offering, and it's not obligatory. So therefore he really doesn't have any right to offer this, because the Torah only permits shchita either for food or for an obligatory korban, for a korban sibur that's an obligation. This is a voluntary korban. You're not, there's no reason to bring it, and therefore your act of shchita is a malacha. So therefore you're going to get malchus for doing a malacha on Yantif. So Amar Lei, da Amar Lachmani. So when Rabbi Yitzchak hears this brisa, he says, who told this brisa to you? It must be Beis Shammai. It must be according to only Beis Shammai. Da Amri, lo amrinan mitoch shehutra hotza letzorach, hutra nami shelo letzorach. Beis Shammai do not hold of this principle of mitoch, that once the Torah permits a malacha for ochel nefesh, then that malacha is permitted for any utility, any utilitarian purpose on Yantif. Di'i Beis Hillel ha'amri mitoch shutra hotza letzorach hutra nami shelo letzorach, because Beis Hillel do hold of the principle of mitoch. So hachanami mitoch shehutra shchita letzorach hutra nami shelo letzorach, and therefore, according to Beis Hillel, you should not get malchus for doing this act of shchita. We may not permit it for you lechatchila, but certainly b'diavad you haven't done a malacha deoraisa on Yantif to deserve malchus, because once the Torah permits you to do shchita for food, then shchita for any utility is permitted mideoraisa on Yantif. So maskef lo rabba mimai de Beis Shammai Beis Hillel b'hapligi dilma be'erev ha'hotza l'Shabbos ve'en erev ha'hotza l'Yamtov kamiflagi. So Rabbi challenges this whole premise. He says, I could interpret our Mishnah differently. Perhaps the issue has nothing to do with this principle of mitoch that the Gemara seems to be aware of and attributes it to Beis Hillel, but maybe that's not what Beis Hillel are saying over here. Perhaps there's a more fundamental machlokes. Is there bichlal a malacha of hotza'ah on Yantif or not? In other words, when the Torah presents us with 39 malachos, and one of those 39 malachos is hotza'ah, maybe there are only 38 malachos on Shabbos and not 39 malachos. Maybe hotza'ah was never prohibited in the first place on Yantif, and that's why you're allowed to carry. Mar savar erev hotza'ah l'Shabbos ve'erev hotza'ah l'Yom Tov, u'mar savar erev hotza'ah l'Shabbos ve'en erev hotza'ah l'Yom Tov. That this is the machlokus from the Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. The reason why we use the word erev and hotza'ah is because the rabbis made a provision of an eruv only when there's a prohibition of carrying. And bichlal, in the case of Yom Tov, there is no prohibition of hotzah, and there's therefore no rabbinic accommodation of an eruv at all. Kidich siv, as the pasuk says, v'lo sotziu maso mibotechem b'yom haShabbos. If you take a look at a pasuk in Yirmiyah, Is there a problem?
No, I just want to open the Gemara for Benny.
Oh, for Benny.
Trying not to
Sorry.
disturb you.
Is the pasuk in Yirmiyah says, do not take any burdens out of your house on the Sabbath. So the fact that even though we have earlier psukim that tell us that there's a malacha of hotzah, but Yirmiyah clarifies, perhaps this is the correct way to interpret the pasuk, that the only time that there's a malacha of hotzah is on Shabbos, because we see that the prophet only admonished the people about Shabbos. He didn't say anything about Yontif. So maybe really there is no malacha of hotzah at all. So b'Shabbos and b'Yom Tov lo. So maskef Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef challenges Rabbi. He says, how could you possibly even suggest that that's the machlokas? Ela me'ata liflagu ba'avanim. If that were the case, then there would be no law of muktzah on Yontif, because one of the most basic reasons why the rabbis instituted the laws of muktzah is to prevent a person from unnecessarily carrying things which might cause him to do the malacha of hotzah. If there is no malacha of hotzah, there's no basis for instituting the isser of muktzah. So therefore, a more fundamental machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel would be, are you allowed to pick up rocks on Yontif or not? And we don't find that ever is the case. We therefore have to conclude the fact that both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel acknowledge that there's an isser of muktzah, means that there is a malacha of hotzah on Yontif, but it is alleviated for all utilitarian purposes on Yontif. In other words, conceptually, there are 39 malachas on Yontif. But when you can justify a need on Yontif for carrying something, then you're allowed to carry it outside on Yontif. Can you still pick up a rock? No, you can't carry a rock. A rock serves no purpose. And therefore, were you to carry a rock on Yontif, you would be liable for the malacha of hotzah, even according to Beis Hillel. But if you can justify a need of something, let's say a child, a lulav, a sefer Torah, and so forth, so then the Torah suspends that prohibition for the same rubric of ochel nefesh.
Are they just as stringent, the malachas on Yontif, as on Shabbos?
No, on Shabbos you get misa and kares.
Right.
And on Yontif you only get malchus.
Why is that? Like, if it's already in
it's based on the way the Torah speaks. The Torah just uses a mitzvah lo saseh for Yontif, and it says by Shabbos ki kol oseh bo malacha yumas. It doesn't say that by Yontif.
That doesn't make room to be more mekel though.
No, not at all. Okay, now there are certain times when you can argue aseh docha lo saseh. Sometimes you can be docha mitzvah lo saseh if it's just a lo saseh grade. If it's just a simple mitzvah lo saseh versus a lo saseh sheyesh bo kares, you can't push off. Sometimes there are circumstances, but they're rare. So the Gemara now says, "Va'af Rabbi Yochanan savar b'mitoch shehutra hotzah l'tzarach hutra nami shelo l'tzarach pligi." And Rabbi Yochanan too concurs with Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, who had said that the machlokus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is about this principle of mitoch. Once the Torah permits ochel nefesh malachas, is that malacha permitted for all purposes? The Tani, and how do I know this? The Tani Tana kamed Rabbi Yochanan, because once a brisa was recited in Rabbi Yochanan's presence, and the brisa was stated as follows: Hamavashel gid hanosha b'chalav b'yomto va'achalo lo kechamesh. That a person, I guess, is really trying hard to anger God. So he takes a gid hanosha, which is the sciatic nerve, which is prohibited, and he cooks it in milk, and he does it on Yontif, and he eats it. So
without a broth.
I guess he could do even worse, right?
Yeah.
So he's going to get
worse.
He can always do worse. So he's going to get malchus 5 times. So what are the 5 times he's going to get malchus? Loka mishum mavashel gid. He's going to get malchus because there's a prohibition of cooking the gid hanosha on Yontif, meaning that you're not allowed to cook on Yontif gid hanosha, because cooking is a malacha, and since this is not a food item, you're not cooking for food, and since you're not cooking for food, you get malchus for cooking on Yontif. Veloka mishum ochel gid, you get malchus for eating the gid hanosha. Veloka mishum mavashel basar b'chalav, you get malchus. Number 3 is you're cooking meat and milk together, which is in itself a prohibition. V'lo kamishum oichel basar b'challah. Then you get malchus because the gid anasha qualifies as meat for these purposes, and therefore you're eating basar b'challah. That's number 4. And number 5, v'lo kamishum havara. And you get malchus for burning a fire to be able to cook this. So you get malchus 5 times.
So 2 on the meat because you're benefiting from cooking as well as you're benefiting from cooking as well as that you're going to eat it.
No, there's a prohibition of cooking. Prohibition of cooking meat and milk.
Right.
Just cooking it is
Even
prohibited, even before you eat it.
Okay.
The Torah says, "Lo savashal gediba chalev imo." Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk 3 times. Why 3 times? One to punish you for cooking, 1 to punish you for eating, and 1 to punish you for benefiting. Okay. So the Gemara now says, Amar Lei. So when Rabbi Yochanan heard this brisa, he says, "Puk tani libra." He says, "Go take this brisa outside," meaning this brisa should not be accepted as authentic because havara ubishal eno mishnah, because you have to subtract 2 of those malchuses. You don't get malchus for cooking, and you don't get malchus for burning. Why? And even if you're going to prove to me that it is an authentic brisa, then it can only be authored by Beis Shammai, who do not hold of this principle of mitoch. Because if you hold of the principle of mitoch, then once the Torah permits a malacha for ochel nefesh, then it permits it for any utilitarian need. So hachanami, lo amrinan mitoch shehutra havar litzarach hutrana mishalo litzarach. So too, you'd have to say over here that this brisa is telling me that we don't say mitoch as far as the malacha of burning. He says the ibe silal kevin damri mitoch shehutra hotzal litzarach hutrana mishalo litzarach hachanami mitoch shehutra havar litzarach hutrana mishalo litzarach. Because according to Beis Hillel, if they say that carrying is permitted even when it's a non-food item, because once the Torah permits carrying for food, it permits it for all utilitarian uses, even for non-food. So then the same thing would be true, even though this gid hanasha is not permitted for me to eat, but since I have a use for it, because I'm going to commit an aveira, and I'm going to eat it, so then I can't be liable for doing the malacha of bishul, or burning a fire for it. It's not a food item, because the Torah prohibits it. So therefore it doesn't fall under the rubric of ochel nefesh. But if you apply the principle of mitoch, then the rubric is expanded to all utilitarian uses, even for non-ochel nefesh uses on Yantiv. So therefore, even though the gid anasha is not considered to be an oichel, it's not considered to be a food, but nevertheless, the principle of mitoch would say that if you cook it, you're not doing a malacha. So therefore, Rabbi Yochanan says, it's clear from Rabbi Yochanan's statement that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are arguing on the whole principle of mitoch. Do we say mitoch or do we not say mitoch? Okay, let's go on to the next Mishnah. Beis Shammai omrim ein molichin chala umatanos l'kohen b'yom tov bein shuhurmu me'emesh bein shuhurmu me'hayom. So Beis Shammai make a statement, and that statement is that you're not allowed to bring tithes to the Kohen on Yantiv, and it makes no difference whether that tithe was taken today or whether it was taken yesterday. Now let's just clarify what we mean by these 2 tithes. Challah is something that you have to take from dough. Now, are you allowed to bake fresh bread on Yantiv? 100%. So if we're permitting you to bake bread, then the dough that you manufacture on Yantiv, you're going to have to tithe. So because you're allowed to tithe it, you should be allowed to schlep it. But comes along Beis Shammai and say, schlepping is an additional act that we don't permit you to do on Yantiv. We don't permit you to go to that exertion of schlepping it to the Kohen, and therefore we will not permit you, even though you have to tithe it, save the challah dough until after Yantiv, and then after Yantiv you'll schlep it to the Kohen. The matanos that they're referring to over here are animal parts. In the times of the temple, anytime a person slaughtered an animal outside the temple, he would have to give what's called the zeroa lechayayim and keva to a Kohen. The zeroa is the arm, the lechayayim are the cheeks, and the keva is the stomach. Those would have to be given to the Kohen. Why we don't do that today anymore? Rashi seems to imply that it only applied in Eretz Yisrael during the times of the Beis HaMikdash, and therefore we don't do this anymore. But nevertheless, these are gifts that are supposed to be given to the Kohen. So Beis Shammai basically say that even though you have a right to bake bread and you have a right to shecht an animal on Yontiv, the one thing that you cannot do is you cannot schlep them over to the Kohen actually physically on Yontiv. That's too much exertion that is not justifiable. Beis Hillel matirin. And Beis Hillel say, no, of course you can. Amru lahem Beis Shammai gezerah shava chala umatanos matana lakohen truma matana lakohen kishem shen molichin es hatruma kachem molichin es hamatanos. Beis Shammai say, let me give you a logical argument why you should not be allowed to schlep. Because chala and animal parts are tithes, and truma is a tithe as well. Truma is I have to tithe from my agricultural produce and give a portion to the Kohen. Now, just like I'm not allowed to schlep over my truma, and apparently you, Beis Hillel, submit to that, so too I shouldn't be allowed to schlep those other tithes to the Kohen either. So Amar lahem Beis Hillel lo. Beis Hillel say it's not a good comparison. Im amartim betruma she'eno zakai b'haramasa, tomru b'matano shezakai b'haramasa. Beis Hillel say, look, I agree with you that truma is not permitted, but you know why? Because you're not allowed to tithe produce on Yontif. You're not allowed to tithe produce on Yontif. Since you can't tithe produce on Yontif, you can't schlep the produce that you tithed yesterday and give it and schlep it over to the Kohen on Yontif. But anything that you're allowed to tithe on Yontif today, because you're allowed to have this fresh product, there the rabbis did permit you to schlep it over to the Kohen. So basically, conceptually, Beis Hillel makes a lot of sense. Beis Hillel is saying, look, there's no reason for you to tithe produce on Yontif. You could have taken care of that before Yontif. So mid'Rabbanan, it's usher for you to tithe. If it's usher for you to tithe, then it's also usher to schlep. But if it's permitted to tithe, because the only way that you can eat fresh bread is by taking challah. The only way that you're allowed to partake of the meat is you're obligated to give the animal parts to the Kohen. So once they permitted you to tithe it, they permitted you to schlep it. So that's the difference according to Beis Hillel. So the Gemara now says,
if you decide on Yontif that you want to pick an apple and eat it,
how can you pick an apple on Yontif?
Good one. Yeah.
That was at the beginning of BEITZA, if you remember.
Yeah.
Okay. The Gemara now says, that's like, forget it. Okay.
Sounded good.
Right, sometimes they call that a klutz kasha, because it's, right, so what if the Rambam said this? But the Rambam never said it. All right, no. Okay, so the Gemara now says, Kasal kadaitach shehurmu mehayom, v'shenishchatu mehayom, v'shehurmu me'emesh, v'shenishchatu me'emesh. So our thinking is that our Mishnah is not distinguishing between things that were tithed today and slaughtered today, or whether they were tithed yesterday and slaughtered yesterday. And so, mani masnisin, lo Rabbi Yossi, v'lo Rabbi Yehuda ela acherim. So we're going to prove that our Mishnah goes like the acherim of a three-way machlokas between Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, and acherim. So what is this brisa? The Tanya. Now, by the way, if you look carefully at the language of the Mishnah says, Bein shehurmu me'emesh, bein shehurmu me'hayom. However, the Gemara is going to equivocate on that statement, and perhaps the Mishnah is only referring to things that where the animal was, let's say, was shechted from yesterday, is Beis Shammai machmer. So we'll see that how the Gemara can suggest that is perhaps because the Mishnah doesn't say explicitly bein shenishchatu me'emesh, bein shenishchatu me'hayom, maybe there's room for equivocation. I have a little bit of a problem with it, but let's see. Let's see what the brisa says. Amar Rabbi Yehuda lo nechluku Beis Shammai u Beis Hillel al hamatano shehurmu me'erev Yom Tov, shemolichin im hamatano shehurmu me'hayom v'shenishchatu me'hayom. So Rabbi Yehuda says that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel both agree that if something was tithed before Yontif and you have stuff that was tithed on Yantif, let's say you have challah that was taken on Yantif and challah that was taken before Yantif, everyone agrees that you're allowed to schlep those together in one basket to the Kohen. Lo nechleku ela lahu lichan bifnei atzman, shebei Shammai omrim ein molichin ubei Hillel omrim molichin. The machlokis is only if you only have stuff that was tithed yesterday. If it was tithed yesterday, then why didn't you schlep it yesterday to the Kohen? And the fact that you didn't means that you were trying to use Yontif to your advantage, and we don't let you do that. We don't let you exploit your leisure on Yontif to do schlepping. And therefore, Beis Shammai say that you, if it was tithed yesterday, you're not allowed to schlep. But Beis Shammai agree that if it was tithed today, if you're making fresh dough today, shechted an animal today, those you are allowed to schlep to the Kohen. They agreed to that. And it's therefore clear that our Mishnah does not seem to be going like Rabbi Yehuda, because our Mishnah says it doesn't make a difference whether the tithe was yesterday or today. And Beis Shammai's argument is just like Truma, when it's tithed the day before cannot be schlepped on Yantiv, so too the tithes that are done the day before cannot be schlepped on Yantiv. So Amr lahem Beis Hillel lo im amartem betruma she'eno zakai b'haramasa terma b'matanos shezakai b'haramasa. And to that Beis Hillel says no, it's not a good comparison. Truma cannot be tithed on Yantiv, and therefore you're not allowed to schlep it on Yantiv. But something that's allowed to be tithed on Yantiv, like challah and matanos, even if you did it the day before, you're allowed to schlep it on Yantiv to the Kohen. So Amar Reb Yossi, that's Reb Yehuda's opinion. Now let's look at Reb Yossi's opinion. Lo nechluku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel al matanos shemolichin. So he says, he's very liberal. He says that challah and matanos and animal parts, everyone agrees, even Beis Shammai agree that you're allowed to schlep those to the Kohen, and it makes no difference whether they were tithed yesterday or tithed today. Lo nechleku ela la truma shebeis Shammai omrim ein molichin and Beis Hillel omrim molichin. The machlokis Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is on truma. The truma that I tithed yesterday, am I allowed to schlep it today to the Kohen or not? Beis Shammai say no. Beis Hillel say yes. So this is the most liberal opinion. Rabbi Yossi says that according to Beis Hillel, you're even allowed to schlep truma to the Kohen on Yantiv. And clearly our Mishnah does not agree to that, because our Mishnah had said that according to Beis Hillel, he agrees that you're not allowed to schlep truma to the Kohen on Yantiv. V'kachayu Beis Hillel danin chalo matanos matana l'kohen and truma matana l'kohen geshem shemolichin es matanos kach molichin es truma. Beis Hillel's argument was, look, we all agree that you're allowed to schlep challah and matanos to the Kohen on Yantiv, so you should be allowed to schlep truma on Yantiv as well. So Amr lahem Beis Shammai lo. And Beis Shammai says, no, there's a fundamental difference between the two. You're not allowed to tithe truma on Yantif, but you're allowed to tithe challah and animal parts on Yantif. So just because you're allowed to schlep your challah and your matanos to a Kohen doesn't automatically mean that you're allowed to schlep your truma to the Kohen. And now let's look at the third opinion, which the Gemara now suggests is going to be consistent with our Mishnah. Acherim omrim lo nechluku Beis Shammai Beis Hillel ala truma she'ein molichin. That they say that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that you're not allowed to schlep truma on Yantif to the Kohen. Lo nechluku ela al hamatanos. The machlokus is only on challah and matanos. She'Beis Shammai omrim ein molichin uBeis Hillel omrim molichin. That Beis Shammai say that you're not allowed to schlep, and Beis Hillel say you are allowed to schlep. Leima acherim hiva lo Rabbi Yehuda. So let us therefore suggest that our Mishnah goes like the acherim, because it seems like that's what our Mishnah is talking about. It makes no difference whether they were tithed yesterday, tithed today. According to Beis Shammai, you're not allowed to schlep them, and according to Beis Hillel, you are. And everyone agrees that truma, you're not allowed to schlep. Amar Rava mikatani shuhurmu mehayom v'shenishchatu mehayom. So Rava says no. It doesn't say explicitly that they were tithed and slaughtered today. Shehurmu kitani. It just says that they were tithed. And therefore, ula olam shchitasan me'emesh. And really, maybe what happened is that you slaughtered the animal yesterday and you tithed it today. So therefore, what the Mishnah really means to say is that maybe you prepared the dough yesterday. And maybe you shechted the animal yesterday from before Yantiv, and you tithed it today. You took the challah today, and you took the animal parts today. And now you want to schlep them over to the Kohen. Maybe that's where maybe that's where our Mishnah is machmer according to Beis Shammai that says you can't. But it could taka be that if you shechted today and you actually made the dough today, then Beis Shammai would agree that you'd be allowed to schlep it. So therefore, that's the diuk that the Gemara is making in our Mishnah. Our Mishnah just says that it was tithed today or yesterday. But what would happen if it was shechted? Maybe the Mishnah means that it was shechted yesterday and the dough was made yesterday. That's the reason why Beis Shammai is machmer. And therefore, according to Beis Shammai, it could turn out that if you didn't shecht it yesterday, but you shechted it today and you tithed it today, maybe Beis Shammai would agree that you're allowed to schlep it. And therefore, the Mishnah seems now more in alignment with Rabbi Yehuda, who had made that distinction. According to Rabbi Yehuda, Beis Shammai is only machmir when you prepared it from yesterday, and you had the opportunity to tithe it yesterday, and you didn't. So that's where Beis Shammai says you're not allowed to schlep it today. So lema Rabbi Yehuda hi below acherim. So therefore, let's say, says our Mishnah, okay, fine, you've proven your point. So you're so convincing that it seems like our Mishnah is only like Rabbi Yehuda now, and not like the Acherim. So the Gemara says, no, afilu tema Acherim uvahanach denishchatu me'emesh. Really, even the Acherim agreed to Rabbi Yehuda that the only time Beis Shammai prohibit schlepping to the Kohen on Yantiv is when the shechita and the dough preparation was done yesterday. And that's where they say, whether you tithed it today or yesterday doesn't matter, but if you shechted it yesterday, say Beis Shammai, you don't have a right to schlep it over to the Kohen today. So the point is that if the Acherim hold that way as well, the Acherim agree that Beis Shammai is only machmir when it was shechted yesterday, but Beis Shammai would agree that it was shechted today, that you would be allowed to schlep it to the Kohen. Well, if that's the case, Yihachi Hainu Rabbi Yehuda. So what's the difference now between the Acherim and Rabbi Yehuda? Ika beinayu tefela. The answer is that according to Rabbi Yehuda, he's even more makel than the Acherim. According to Rabbi Yehuda, like the Brisa had spoken out, if I have stuff that was shechted today and that the dough was made today, and I have stuff that was shechted yesterday and it was tithed today, then I have a right to take them in unison, put them in the same basket, and schlep them all to the Kohen. According to the Acherim, I don't have a right to do that, because the stuff that was shechted yesterday, I don't have a right to schlep it at all, even if I'm schlepping it in the same basket as stuff that I just shechted today. So that would be the machlokus. But now we've successfully modified our understanding of the Mishnah. According to Beis Shammai, the only time that it's prohibited to schlep animal tithes and challah tithes to the Kohen is if you made the dough yesterday or you shechted the animal yesterday. Then it makes no difference whether you actually tithed it today or before Yantiv. You don't have a right, according to Beis Shammai, to schlep it. But if you shechted it today or you made the dough today, even Beis Shammai agree that you're allowed to schlep it to the Kohen. Let us go on. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, halacha ka Rabbi Yossi. That Shmuel says the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, the most liberal opinion of the three in the Brisa, who says that according to Beis Hillel, it's permitted to even schlep truma to the Kohen on Yantif. Okay? Rav Tuvi berei de Rav Menachem yahavale garva de chamer de truma, asalakami de Rav Yosef armalo mahula amtu yila Kohen ha'idna. And now the Gemara brings the Maisa. He says that Rav Tuvi had a container of wine that was truma. He had tithed it from before Yantif, as the halacha requires, but he hadn't yet given it as a gift to the Kohen yet. So he comes over to Rav Yosef and he says, do I have permission to schlep this over to my favorite Kohen on Yantif and present it to him? Amar lei hachi amar Rav Yehuda amar Shmuel halacha ka Rav Yossi. And he said yes, because you see that Shmuel Paskins like Rav Yossi, who says that Beis Hillel is so permissive that they even permit you to schlep truma on Yantif. Ushpezichne de Rava barav Chanan havale isuraisa de chargula. A related story, not having to do now with Truma, but having to do with acts on Yantif. The innkeeper of Rava, or Rabba bar Rav Chanan, he had stalks of mustard. In other words, mustard seed grows on stalks, and the mustard seed had not yet been separated from the stalks. So he asked him a question: would it be permitted for me to crumble apart the mustard seed from the stalk on Yantif and to consume the mustard seed on Yantif? Lo hava biyadeh. He didn't know the answer. By the way, mustard is considered kitnius for those, just as a reminder. So he didn't know. He didn't know the answer, whether that would be permitted or not. Asalakame de Rabba, Amar lei molul in malilos umafarchen kitnios b'yom tov. So he came to Rabba, and Rabba paskin for him that it is permitted to separate the wheat kernels from their husk, and it is also permitted to separate legumes from their pods and from their stalks on Yantif. As long as you do it by hand, it's perfectly permitted. So Eisvei Abaye challenges Rabba with the following brisa: Hamolel melilos me'erev Shabbos lemachar minafeach miyad liyad ve'oichel avalo b'kenon velo b'tamchoy. The halacha is as follows: that if a person is being molel melilos, what that means is that you're using your fingers to separate the wheat kernel from the husk. As long as you do that from before Shabbos, because you can't do it on Shabbos itself, and yet you've separated the wheat kernels from the husk, but you still have all of the chaff on the table mixed in with the wheat kernels. All you've done is that you've done some kind of finger manipulation to separate them so that they're no longer connected, but they're still mixed with each other. So on Shabbos, you're allowed to blow the chaff so that all you're left with is wheat, and you're not doing a nisser of borer because you're not doing it in the normative fashion. What you're not allowed to do is do it with a funnel or some kind of separation plate tray, because that would be akin to, that's borer, so you're doing a malacha, you're sifting. Next, hamolel melilos me'erev yom tov. In a similar situation, doing this on Yantif, if you separate the wheat kernels from the husks from before Yantif, lamachar minafeach al yad, the next day you're allowed to separate the chaff from the wheat kernels, even in the normative fashion, using a funnel and a regular sifting plate. However, va'ochel, and you can eat it. However, afilu, and you can use afilu b'tamchi, even the normative instruments, because separating on Yantif is permitted. However, avalo b'tavla, avalo b'nafa, avalo b'kevara. But you're not allowed to use these larger instruments, these larger appliances. And the reason is not because there's a malacha involved, but rather because it looks like you're doing something on Yantif or after Yantif, because you're doing it in large quantities. Okay? But what do you see from this brisa? Says Abaya me'erev Yom Tov in b'Yom Tov lo. That Abaya says, you see that this brisa only permits you to separate the wheat kernels from their husks from before Yantif. But on Yantif, it doesn't permit you to do that. So how can you, Rabbi, say that you are allowed to separate the mustard seed from the pod or from the stalk on Yantif itself? So afilu tema b'Yom Tov. Va'aidi the Tana Reisha me'erev Shabbos Tana Seifa Nami me'erev Yom Tov. So Rabbi's response was no. The brisa really even permits you to separate the wheat kernels from their husk on Yom Tov itself. But for symmetry, since the first part was talking about on Shabbos, and that on Shabbos we clearly acknowledge that you're not allowed to do that kind of separation, it therefore talked about doing the same kind of thing from before Yantif. But even on Yantif it's permitted. But since the brisa was talking about that, when you separate the wheat kernels from the husks from before Shabbos, what are you allowed to do on Shabbos to blow away the chaff? So it used the symmetrical point of talking about separating the wheat kernels from the husk from before Yantif, and what do you do with the chaff, right? But the truth is, on Yantif, you're even allowed to separate the wheat kernels from the husks on Yantif itself also. So frak the Gemara, but I have a problem now. Imkein matzinu truma shezakai baharamasa. Utnan lo imamartim betruma sheino zakai baharamasa. I now have a question. It seemed from our Mishnah that everyone agrees that you're not allowed to take truma on Yantif. That was the whole premise of our Mishnah. But the question is, can you schlep truma on Yantif? But everyone agrees from our Mishnah that you're not allowed to tithe on Yantif. Now, if you're telling me that it's permitted for a person to separate grain from husks on Yantif itself, how are you going to eat it? How are you going to? You got to take truma. And if you can't take truma, then how can we permit you to do it if you can't eat it? So the Gemara says, Lo kasha ha Rebbe ha Reb Yossi beRebbe Yehuda. The answer is, says the Gemara, that everyone agrees that you are allowed to separate the kernels from the husks. The machlokus is going to be whether you're obligated to take truma in such a situation or not. Our Mishnah holds that that's not subject to truma. That's Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi is of the opinion that even when you separate the kernels from the husks, it becomes subject to truma. D'Tanya, hichnes shibolin la'asos mehanisa, that if a person brings in stalks of wheat, sheaves of wheat, with the objective of making that wheat into flour and eventually turning that into dough, so ochel mehen aryai upater. Then since it is in its raw form and it needs to be processed before it becomes subject to the product that I'm looking to get from it, if I wanted to eat these kernels in a happenstance fashion, then it's perfectly fine. They're not subject to tithing, because since the fruit that I'm trying to get from these stalks is going to be ground into flour, now that they're in their raw state, they're not even considered to be the fruit yet. It's in their intermediary state, and they're not subject to truma yet. But lemolalan b'malilos. But if I brought the stalks in order to just be able to pull out the grain from them and to eat the grain whole on Yantif, so Rebbe Mechayev, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Poter. Rebbe says that you're liable for truma at that point because now you've got the finished product, and Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda says no. Even in that case, you're going to be poter, and the reason is because the gancha ksiv, like Rashi says, until you've actually accumulated a pile of grain, it doesn't yet become subject to truma. So the bottom line is, says the Gemara, according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, they're not subject to tithes, and that's why our Mishnah says you're not allowed to tithe, but you would still be allowed to eat this grain. There is another opinion, though, that's Rebbe, who says that you are obligated to tithe, and according to Rebbe, taka the halacha will be that you're even allowed to tithe on Yantiv if it comes to a point where the only way that you can eat this grain is by tithing it. Have a wonderful Shabbos.